Hi, everybody. Before we start, I'd just like to acknowledge that here in Macquarie, we acknowledge the traditional custodians of Macquarie University land, the Wadawurrung clan of the Darug Nation, whose cultures and customs have nurtured us and continue to nurture this land since the Dreamtime. And we pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging. It's a great pleasure today to be introducing Dr. Jill Vaughan. She's clearly a rising star in sociolinguistics, and her work is well known in Australia and beyond. Jill is a senior research associate with the Research Unit for Indigenous Languages at the University of Melbourne. She's a project officer with the fabulously successful 50 Words project, which I recommend you check out. I think it's 50words.online or something like that. And also one of the instigators of the equally successful Linguistics Roadshow, which is a project that takes sociolinguistics to rural and outback high schools. So also do check out lingroadshow.com. These are fabulously fabulous projects, and the websites are really cool. Jill's PhD research looked at the maintenance of the Irish language within Ireland and amongst diaspora communities in Canada, the US and in Australia. She has had 3 postdoctoral fellowships, 1 in Trondheim in Norway and 2 at the University of Melbourne, including an Endangered Languages Documentation Program Award entitled Documenting Barada Dialectal Variation within the Multilingual Ecology of North Central Arnhem Land. And along with Gillian Wigglesworth and Jane Simpson, she's co-editor of the volume Language Practices of Indigenous Children and Youth, The Transition from Home to School. This is a Palgrave series. And with Dr. Ruth Singer, she's an editor of Special Edition of Language Communication on Indigenous Multilingualisms. And she has numerous articles on code switching and translanguaging, and has contributed book chapters on multilingualism to the Oxford Guide on Australian Languages and the Handbook of Language Contact. Now, what I suspect Jill is going to talk about is some of her work with Barada Gunatba speakers of around Maningrida. And this is the area of central and western Arnhem Land has always had extremely high linguistic diversity. Maningrida, I think, has around about 10 or so languages from a variety of different families. And most people speak about 5 or 6 languages, I think, maybe many more. I'm not going to steal your talk, Jill, but I want to make a point here. So that this is in stark contrast with other parts of the country where traditional languages are really struggling to maintain their vitality. So there's something really special about this part of Australia, and because it sort of bucks the national trend, okay? So what's going on with this linguistic ecology, what's going on that makes it so vital, I think, is fascinating. They're obviously doing something right there in and around Maningrida, and I think all of us attending this conference will be very interested in what's happening there. And because we've all got a lot to learn from this unusual situation, I think. So it's with great pleasure that I hand over to Jill Vaughan, who's very much engaged with these sorts of issues, okay? So she's going to tell us about valuing multilingualism's insights from Indigenous Australia.
Thank you so much, Joe, for that really kind introduction. And also thanks so much to everybody for the invitation to speak today. So I want to begin with 2 important acknowledgements to follow on from Joe's. First and foremost, to the speakers of Indigenous languages that I'll be talking about today, so particularly those of the Arnhem Land and the Maningrida region, and especially the speakers of the Barada language, to whom so much of my knowledge about this topic is really greatly indebted, and also to some colleagues with whom I've had really fruitful discussions about these ideas. And so to those named here and to many more, I gratefully acknowledge their contributions. And secondly, I want to acknowledge the Wadamaragal clan of the Darug Nation, custodians of the land where some of Macquarie's campuses are situated, and also that I'm speaking from the Wurundjeri, the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation here in Naarm, Melbourne, and the language of this land is Woiwurrung. Okay, so to begin, just a little story from a fairly portentous historical moment. So that of the arrival of Europeans on Australian shores in the late 18th century. And so in the previous century, various Dutch, Spanish and French explorers had been sort of sailing around and occasionally coming ashore along the coast of the island and around the Torres Strait, but without any long-term contact with the local landowners. And then in 1770, James Cook and his crew landed in northeast Australia, and as part of what they got up to around Wallumbiri, what's now known as the Endeavour River region, they collected a word list, which you can see part of that here from the local Indigenous people. And this is the earliest known word list that was collected of an Australian language. At the time, this was described as a short vocabulary in the New Holland language. And so it was confidently armed with this list that Captain Arthur Phillip, along with the First Fleet, then arrived at what's now known as Port Jackson, north of Botany Bay, and very much expecting that these words would see them right in communicating with the local people that they were going to find there. And the assumption being that there was a single Australian language and there was no variation really that they needed to trouble themselves about. And so now we know that the word list that they had collected at Endeavour River was in the northeast Australian language Guguyimidir. And the colonisers were then understandably chagrined to discover that the local Eora people they tried to communicate with at Port Jackson understood absolutely nothing of their prepared list. And in fact, when the Eora people heard these unfamiliar words, they naturally enough assumed that they belonged to the language of the Englishmen. And so in this way, the new arrivals began to get a bit of an inkling that the place where they had just found themselves was not quite so monolingual or monocultural as they had naively and probably quite racistly assumed. And in fact, Indigenous Australia was and is fundamentally an intensely multilingual place. And this statement about it being multilingual has two meanings, both of which are true. So first, that Australia is home to many, many languages, as I'll talk a bit more about, languages which have developed here for tens of thousands of years, which is incidentally a much greater time depth than the, say, 7,000 or 8,000 years between Proto-Indo-European and the contemporary day. The second meaning of this statement is that it's also the case that individual language repertoires were and are in many places still highly multilingual in a great diversity of ways and in many regions of Australia, particularly in Northern Australia, where we'll be talking about today. So multilingual people, but also multilingual region. And yet, as we've heard already, and we'll hear more about no doubt across this excellent conference, contemporary Australia, of course, remains strongly under the influence of a monolingual mindset. So today, what I want to do is give you a bit of an insight into the multilingualisms, plural, that characterise Indigenous Australia in both historical and contemporary perspective. And at the heart of the talk will be a zoom in particularly, as Joe mentioned, on the value of languages in the highly multilingual community of Maningrida in north central Arnhem Land on the sort of central coast of Northern Australia. Okay, so let's begin with another small story. So a short vignette from north central Arnhem Land. So from the country between, you can see on there, the Tompkinson River and the Cadell River. And here, as the story goes, two ancestral beings, two frogs, emerged and travelled together over the land, and they argued with each other as they went along. And one frog spoke the Gurgoni language and the other spoke the Guningu language. And when they arrived at the place called Numoromu, this second frog said in Guningu, let's stay here together. You're going to speak Gunarpur, Gugoni, and I'm going to go over there and speak Gungaji Walakud, Guningu, two types of subtypes of those languages. Then we'll speak, you wait there, and I'm going to put myself down here as a dreaming, as a frog. And then the two frogs set themselves down and they lie there talking still. And so this story is fairly typical of Dreamtime stories in which ancestral heroes travel through the landscape, implanting language into different territories. In the Kimberley, in Northwest Australia, for example, it's Possum who placed the Ngarinyan language in the landscape at Gulaman, Beverly Springs, and from there carried it over the present-day Ngarinyan country, while in Northwest Arnhem Land, it's Wadawurrungi, who is a female creator being who emerged from the sea, travelled over the land and created children, assigning each of them a language as she went, a language to speak in each place. And these Dreamtime travels and actions highlight all sorts of key principles regarding multilingualism in Indigenous Australia. First and foremost, the connection between language and land, which is absolutely paramount. This is whereby each language is primordially and eternally associated with a specific tract of territory. And distinctions between language varieties, and also in other cultural practice, in art, in music, and so on, are couched principally in the idiom of local geography, to borrow a phrase from Peter Sutton, and dimensionalized into the geographical and the social cosmos, as Nick Evans has phrased it. But this doesn't mean that language boundaries divide up ethnic groups in any neat way. Instead, language differences in many regions are actually internal to society, and it can be other social groupings, so perhaps the clan or a moiety, for example, which are more salient. Doesn't mean that languages aren't important indexes for cultural identity, but they're typically not the primary one, at least pre-colonially. And so you might note those two terms in the Gurgoni frog story, Gunarpur and Gungaji, Walak wood, which are both words for small in the Gurgoni and Guningu languages respectively. And so these represent two parallel dialects within the two languages, both named for a kind of shibboleth lexeme that distinguishes them from other dialects of the language, of each language. And these parallel shibboleths are an example of a shared sociolinguistic system that transcends individual languages and instead exists at the level of an entire multilingual regional system, in this case Arnhem Land, or a region within Arnhem Land, within which speakers are different, but different together, to borrow a phrase from the Maung songman James Gulamungu. Okay. Now for some numbers. So our best estimate is that at the time of European invasion in 1788, there were more than 500 spoken varieties across 32 or so language families. So more than are represented on this map by David Horton and produced by IATSIS. A single language family, Pamanyungan, covers most of the Australian mainland, but some 27 other language families, now usually referred to as non-Pamanyungan or grouped under that umbrella term, are found across Northern Australia, from the Kimberley across to the Gulf of Carpentaria. There were likely also a number of Tasmanian languages across several language families, and also some sign languages. It's not clear how many, that's a matter of ongoing research, but they seem to have been widespread. And as I've said, this linguistic diversity developed over tens of thousands of years. And speaker numbers probably averaged 1,000 to 3,000 people, with some languages maintained for a very long time with only a few hundred speakers or even fewer. And so a quick plug for a couple of online resources, some of which Joe's already mentioned, that will allow you to explore some of this really rich linguistic diversity and to have a bit of a listen to some words in Australian languages to get a feel for them. So First Language Australia's Gambay map shows Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander language names and groupings that are favoured by contemporary communities. It's probably the most complete representation that we have at the moment. The website up the top there. And then, as Joe said, the 50 Words Project, which we host at the Research Unit for Indigenous Language at Melbourne Uni, showcases 50 words in many languages from across the region. At the moment, we're nearing 80 languages in our data set, and these have all been uploaded with permission from communities. So I encourage you to go have a listen. Okay, so we've already heard about some of the language ideologies that underpin the role of language in Indigenous Australia, such as the intrinsic connection between language and land. And we can begin to see how these ontologies about the place of language within a broader sociocultural system might shape the nature of multilingualism but let's consider a few more. So this primordial connection between language and land means that individuals associated with a particular tract of land by virtue, say, of clan membership, are then understood to own the language associated with that territory. And so in Northern Australia, at least, individuals inherit clan affiliation, therefore land and language affiliation, through their father, or rather their father's father. The patriline, with other linguistic and land rights inherited through connections to other kin. So for example, the mother's father, mother's mother. But it's the father's language, the patrilect, that's therefore ideologically paramount in Arnhem Land, for example. But because groups living together tended to be made up of people from multiple clans, since it was usual to marry outside of your clan and therefore sometimes outside of your language group, domestic and social life was by default multilingual. And so an important distinction in both ideology and practice has to do with the distinction between languages that you can speak. And in ideology, these are ideally languages that you've inherited and have rights and responsibilities towards, versus those that you can just hear, i.e. those that you have receptive competence in, but not necessarily spoken proficiency. And this theme will come up a few more times in the talk. So language ideologies, as are their nature, they tell us something about the drivers behind language practices, but they rarely map onto each other very neatly, ideologies and practices. And so in practice, the split between speaking your rightful language and hearing others might not be so neat. So for various reasons, for example, lack of access to your patrilect or life circumstances bringing you into contact with other languages, you might in fact not speak the language that you own, or you may well speak a language that you don't own, okay? And so these ideologies sometimes tend to erase some of the, I guess, the messiness or the tensions that exist in real life language practices. In any case, to pick up on something Joe mentioned, it seems that linguistic repertoires were commonly fairly large and still are in some parts of Australia. So certainly likely significant variation across regions for all sorts of factors, for all sorts of reasons. But individuals are reported to have spoken 4 or more languages in the Victoria River District in the NT, half a dozen languages in Arnhem Land, and at least one report of speakers having some knowledge of more than 30 languages or dialects in the Murchison River region of Western Australia. And it was common to continue to acquire multiple languages across the lifespan. And this was motivated by both utilitarian but also aesthetic impulses. So being multilingual facilitated family connections, social, ceremonial, economic connections, travel onto new country, and also things like verbal artistry. So with multilingual mastery being something that was typically quite highly valued, considered to be distinguished and evidence of far-flung social capital. And these multilingual repertoires and practices meant that in pre-colonial times, and in some places still nowadays, there wasn't the same linguistic pressure towards accommodation. The idea that it's natural to adjust our speech or our signing or our communicative practices to be aligned with our interlocutor, that doesn't necessarily always apply here. And so linguistic diversity doesn't necessarily have to be an impediment to communication as it is so often framed. And the lack of drive towards accommodation has some pretty interesting outcomes, plays out in various ways in terms of linguistic outcomes that we can observe in the Australian context. So for example, we'll talk a bit more about both of these, the seemingly widespread use of receptive multilingualism, not just as, so the practice where each interlocutor maintains his or her own language in an interaction. And that's often seen in situations of language shift, where older generations perhaps maintain their language and younger generations do something different. But this is a characteristic of stable multilingualism in the region. Another example is the fact that pre-colonially and in some regions still, there were no lingua francas. So no common language used when speakers of different languages encountered each other. And this fact is really made possible by the norm being those sort of partially overlapping and often very large multilingual repertoires, as we will see. Okay. So now a just brief step back to consider where pre-colonial Australia might have fitted within a broader typology of societal multilingualisms. So even though multilingualism has very much been the norm throughout human history, as we all know, the literature actually tells us surprisingly little about the full range of societal multilingualisms that exist. And this is because nation states, or one of the reasons is that nation states have typically naturalized hierarchical models of multilingualism, and these models have therefore been more obvious to perhaps a Western scholarly gaze. And so the most familiar model of multilingualism perhaps is usually termed diglossia, which many of you will know, or polyglossia, when more than two languages are involved. The main characteristics being that languages coexisting are subject to domain specialization, usually within some kind of hierarchy. And so the classic structure being a high language used for more formal settings and a low language or dialect used for more everyday domestic settings. But actually there are many models of multilingualism, many multilingualisms. And so Joshua Fishman, in his very early 1967 articulation of societal multilingualisms and multilectalisms, posited several types, hinging on the presence or absence of bilingualism at the individual level and diglossia at the society level. But it's clear, though, that Fishman understood diglossia to be the only way for multiple codes to coexist in a society without one code eventually replacing the others. So he didn't recognise that multilingualism without diglossia, as we see in pre-colonial Australia, for example, could be a stable system across time, a really viable one. Furthermore, there's been a lack of attention in the literature to linguistic relations between Indigenous languages. So in the first place, societies at these sort of so-called global peripheries have often been sidelined just due to the sheer volume of work on major world languages in urban and Western contexts. But when they do garner attention, it's often focused on the dynamics between a colonial language on one hand and a traditional Indigenous language on the other hand. Not to say there's been no work of this kind, of course, there's been wonderful work on American pre-contact dynamics, for example, and certainly some really important work in the Australian context, absolutely. But very commonly, these inter-Indigenous dynamics have been overshadowed by colonially mediated contact, or sometimes rendered invisible by biased assumptions from things like linguistic nationalism. And so an important recent addition to the typology of societal multilingualisms, and one that perhaps helps us articulate how high levels of multilingualism can and indeed have functioned so successfully around the world without polyglossia, is small-scale multilingualism, also known as egalitarian multilingualism, convivial multilingualism. This is now a subfield of scholarship on multilingualism that has provided a central gathering point for lots of contemporary work on these kinds of multilingual contexts around the globe. And so small-scale multilingualism refers to language ecologies where multiple languages are spoken, usually by quite small speaker groups. People learn each other's languages. People often marry outside the language group. And importantly, those languages aren't subject to any kind of strict hierarchy or any prestige differential or power differential. No, and there's not necessarily any notion of the standard language within these ecologies. And so language ecologies of this kind have been described around the world, and increasingly we're seeing more descriptions of these. So among other places, in the Lower Casamance region in Senegal, the Lower Fungom in the Cameroonian grassfields, Valpes region of Northwest Amazonia, Southern New Guinea, various other places. And it's been argued that this may in fact be the most widespread type of language setting globally, but also historically. And this set of characteristics accounts fairly well for what we know about pre-colonial Australia, although there are some minor but important differences, as we'll see. And in some Indigenous Australian communities, reflexes of this system continue to exist. And so Ruth Singer's also done very important work on this topic. Friederike Lübke has been a really important driver of driving this field ahead and making it a gathering point for contemporary work. All right, so back to Australia. Now just a quick sense of what's happening in contemporary Australia. As you can probably tell, language ecologies look very different now to how they looked pre-colonially. So the invasion and colonisation of Australia was, of course, absolutely catastrophic for the region's languages. So since the early days of colonisation, huge numbers of Aboriginal people and language speakers were moved or forcibly removed from traditional homelands to other places. Some sent to cattle stations, missions, reserves, while others sought out new resources available in urban communities. And now nearly 80% of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people are living in urban areas. So the massive incursion of English and the emergence of post-colonial varieties has dramatically reshaped Australia's language ecologies. Although the effects of colonisation haven't been uniformly experienced across the region. So communities vary as to the extent of the intrusion of English and other artefacts of the colonial project. But in any case, the 21st century has seen the language ecology being one of great diversity and ongoing rapid change. The numbers paint a pretty grim picture, with at present fewer than 20 of those languages we saw before, spoken at the time of invasion, being still learnt by children. Most of these found in central and northern Australia, but some other regions, as you can see in this table, it's grouped by region. But alongside this widespread loss is the emergence of new varieties, new linguistic vehicles for identity. And so Creole is now, in fact, the Australian Aboriginal language with the largest speaker community. It's an English lexified Creole language, and the label Creole subsumes a number of mutually intelligible varieties stretching across northern Australia. We also have mixed languages in the picture, which fuse lexical and structural elements from both the traditional language and Creole or English, and of course, the many varieties of Aboriginal English spoken across the country, born of contact, and which differ in many ways from Australian English mainstream varieties. And so on the one hand, but urbanisation, new trajectories of mobility and other processes that have precipitated this crisis of language loss. And this has in many ways had a homogenising influence on language practice. So we see now the emergence of lingua francas where there were none pre-colonially, as I mentioned, and we see the emergence of diglossia and polyglossia where there were none before. On the other hand, though, changes such as urbanisation, have created increased and wide-reaching opportunities for multilingual practices of new kinds. So cities like Darwin in the Northern Territory are now home to speakers of dozens of Aboriginal languages. So quote here from Murray Guard, wherever Aboriginal population density has increased, so has language diversity. So that's one perspective. And so these contemporary patterns of multilingualism vary massively, as Joe mentioned. So we'll hear a lot in a moment about a highly multilingual language ecology, which is quite unusual, involving many traditional languages in Maningrida. But in a community like Yakanara, for example, in the southern Kimberley region in WA, Walmatjari is the traditional language of the community, but it's been largely displaced by Fitzroy Valley Creole as the language of day-to-day interaction, with some standard Australian English spoken in formal settings and with non-Aboriginal people. And this is more typical perhaps of a general trend across many remote communities in central and northern Western Australia. And then in Mildura, in northwest Victoria, for another point of contrast, Aboriginal English and Standard Australian English are the dominant varieties for Koori people in that region, with the traditional languages of Mildura, such as Tadi Tadi and Lachi Lachi, no longer spoken, haven't been spoken for a long time, but several undergoing reclamation and salvage work. And actually in Mildura, there's a large number of Barkindji people from further north in New South Wales, whose language is undergoing quite successful revitalisation, being taught in schools and so on. And so the language ecology of Mildura is more typical of majority non-Aboriginal communities, for example, and of communities in Australia's south and eastern coasts. So across the board, contemporary Indigenous Australia is characterised by an explosion of new ways of speaking, in part brought about by this general shift to urban communities, but various other factors, changes in mobility, what's been termed hypermobility in some regions, and also the affordances of media, social media. We see an emergence of what's been termed digital diglossia, where traditional language speakers in most settings are using English in social media, for example. And so these recent changes have created new domains for the deployment of contemporary multilingual repertoires. Okay. So for the next part of the talk, we're going to finally travel together to coastal Arnhem Land to spend some time in the community of Maningrida. And to welcome you to Maningrida, I'm just going to hand over to some friends and collaborators from the Lura Language and Culture team, which is the language teaching team at the Maningrida College. So I'll just leave you in their capable hands for a moment.
My name is Cindy Jinmar Binyaya Mal Planjan Arawa Jibena Papur Mlarki. Maningrida community, NT, and we in peripheral C, we have 3,000 people with 30 outstation homelands area. The language in community, Maningrida community, Japana, Brada, Gunbalang, Nakara, Kurgoni, Kuningur, Remberanga, Kune, Jenang, Wulaki, Ilngamata. The main language are Japana. The language we teach here is Brada, Japana, Kune, Jenang, and Ilngamata.
Yo, ngapa? Napalamiri nala ngawala. Anyong nala. So ngapa? Abang ani di school. Ngapa also di wewa inyera dogorji clan group. Dogorji ngapa? And di inyera jang kranye debiana. Digranye Jomi logo Lura representing Gunnar different mucha anawla mucha kami pin wala pa ni Lura yarnepo das be gipo school anawla mucha kanepi wala pa anawla
Hello, ngare yagre Stanley Jalara and ngare erwana jine school argala ngole Jelanga Jira outstation Jamadi Yurungur Pamban airport Ngol school regale outstation Girungur Brigale Baple Maningrida school. Okay, in Maningrida I am now usable chairperson and a language teacher. In our language activity we teach about bush medicine, we go out camping in Euro Point and Rocky Point, and we do this walkabout program with the kids, show them water holes, sacred water holes, bush tuckers, bush medicine, how to make spear, how to make boomerang, how to make clapstick, how to sing crockery, how to dance, how to collect clay for dancing, how to weave mat and make spear for dancing. That's it, I think.
Okay, so Maningrida is remarkable for
My name is Cindy.
For a host of reasons, some of which you'll have picked up on. So the multilingualism represented there. So Cindy was speaking Barada, Joseph was speaking in Jebana, and Stanley was speaking Jinang. And you can see some of the strategies. For example, the school has named one of their councils after the word for fire in Jebana and Barada in an effort to capture some of the local diversity in their naming practices. So Maningrida is home to world-renowned bark painting, sculptural artists, skilled weavers, beautiful textile printers, some lovely coastal scenery, and some pretty interesting local wildlife. But it's also home to incredible linguistic diversity, as Joe mentioned. And even for Northern Australia, it's pretty remarkable. So it's already a hotspot for linguistic diversity in Northern Australia, but it's likely up there with the most linguistically diverse regions in the world, with around 12 to 15, depending on how you count it, languages spoken or signed on a daily basis among fewer than 3,000 people. And so, as I mentioned at the start, any knowledge that I have of this topic is massively indebted to my collaborators and friends in Maningrida. I've been working with speakers of several local languages in Maningrida since around 2014. And together we've been working on various kinds of community and research projects, some of which Joe mentioned. So with the Lura language and culture team, some of who you've now met, we've been undertaking documentation of the different dialects of the Barada language. And we've been recording multilingual encounters across all sorts of community settings, such as at the school, at the church, and at the footy, which we're going to see in a moment. And with folks at the Bapara Women's Centre, top right here, and Maningrida Arts and Culture, we've been recording the multilingual narratives from local artists about their clans and their dreamings and how those are represented in their artworks. So let's just quickly overview Maningrida's language ecology before getting into some specifics. So Maningrida's contemporary multilingualism is in part due to the region's long-standing high levels of linguistic diversity. So the many languages of Arnhem Land each form part of a multilingual regional system. And you can see Maningrida here with its traditional Njebena name in the red box. And the local languages marked in dark red as well. And so this is something we see in other contexts of small-scale multilingualism, but Maningrida's multilingualism is also due to the fact that it serves as a central hub in a contemporary way for groups who formerly lived further afield in Arnhem Land. And so I mentioned earlier that the non-Pama-Nyungan language, so the Pama-Nyungan language family covers most of Australia with 27 other language families bunched across the north. And so Maningrida sits right on that boundary. So some languages from the Pama-Nyungan language group represented here, but also languages from the Maningridan, Gunwinguan and the Wajan families, plus English and Creole to an extent. And additionally, there's a local alternate sign language used alongside spoken language, which crosses over the boundaries of spoken languages in the region. And so several very small languages are still being learned by children here. So for example, Gurgoni with only a few dozen speakers. This is an increasingly rare situation worldwide, and it's distinct from the vast majority of Aboriginal communities in Australia, as we've heard. Reflexes of a small-scale egalitarian multilingual ecology, therefore, still very much evident here. But the incursion of English and contact varieties has, to an extent, disrupted the operation of that sustainable balance between the local traditional languages, and this emergent polyglossia, which we're starting to see, may well intensify over time. We'll have to see. So Maningrida itself is on land belonging to the Njebena-speaking Gunabidji people. So you can see that here in dark red at the mouth of the Liverpool River. And the Dugriji clan specifically own this land, as you might have noted from Joseph's introduction. And so this fact confers special rights onto the Njebena language as the language of the land. But its central role in community interactions belies the small size of the speaker community, because Njebena has fewer than 200 speakers. And so of the many other language groups now represented in Maningrida, Barada is the largest, over here to the right, it's traditional country, followed by Guningu, which is southwest of what you're seeing here. And so these languages are also heard more commonly than others in public settings, for example. Having said that, it's still the case that there's no real lingua franca that functions as a default language in interactions between people from all these different language groups. Instead, as is the case in many contexts of small-scale multilingualism, people are drawing on their highly multilingual repertoires, as we'll see in a moment. So here's another way of looking at the linguistic diversity of Maningrida. Many languages listed, and distinctions between languages that people speak, that they call their main language, and the one that they speak most of the time. So how is it that Maningrida is so multilingual, and how does this connect with the region's linguistic diversity? Well, there's a few key elements of local sociolinguistic life that are at play here and that underpin these connected phenomena. So firstly, multilingual repertoires. So daily encounters in Maningrida are more often than not multilingual, as we'll see. This is enabled by the fact that individual linguistic repertoires are typically pretty large. So an average linguistic repertoire here takes in at least 4 languages, and not uncommonly up to 7 or more languages. Levels of multilingualism tend not to be evenly balanced across main language groups. So larger, more socially dominant groups such as Barada and Guningu people tend to speak fewer languages, and those belonging to socially less dominant language groups tend to speak more, and that's a pretty common pattern across the globe. So let's meet a few locals and get an insight into their repertoires. So the top right here, we have Abigail. I've worked with Abby quite a lot, and she's a young Barada language worker. She also speaks a couple of Yung varieties, Yungumata and Jinang. She has some ability to speak Njebena and Guningu, and she hears them pretty well, so she understands them pretty well. There's also English and Creole too. Marlene on the left here is a young Njebena traditional owner. She works at the local takeout, and like most Njebena people, she also speaks fluent Guningu and several other local languages, plus some from further afield, like Maratil from over the sort of Wadia, Daly River region, plus English. Another young Njebena woman, Patricia, she's a member of the popular local all-women's rock band Ripple Effect, some of you might have heard of. She's particularly multilingual. She speaks 5 local languages besides her main language, and also English, and she hears Barada pretty well. And lastly, Stanley is a senior Jinang man who we met before. He's an important local elder, and like many Jinang people, he also speaks Barada, it's his mother's language, as well as Yolngu and English. So these lists are interesting, but they don't tell us much about how people connect to their individual languages or how they use them. So let's take a closer look at Abby's repertoire. So Abby inherited her affiliation to specifically the Martai dialect of Barada, it's the Eastern dialect, via her membership in the Malara clan group through her father's side. But Yanangu, a Yolngu language, is actually the original language affiliation of that group. And so that's really a central language for her too. And she owns it, even though she doesn't really speak it. And as she explains in this quote, she learned Barada, Martai Barada, growing up at Wureja, which is the outstation where her grandparents live. And she speaks Martai Barada, known as the hard rather than the soft dialect of Barada. She understands Jinang well. It's important to her as her mother's father's language. And she uses this and Yolngu when she's visiting family in Eastern Arnhem Land. And Yanangu, as I've said, is a major language for her kin. Njebena, though, is not an ideologically important language for Abby, but she hears it every day where she lives in Bottom Camp in Maningrida. She understands it and she can speak it a bit. It's the same with Guningu because there's many speakers of Guningu around in Maningrida. And English she uses daily in her job as a language worker at the school and also with other Balanda, so European Australians around town. So a particularly useful method for opening the door to discussing language repertoires with people is the linguistic portrait. So this was originally developed by Crum and Jenkins, popularised by Austrian linguist Brigitte Busch, and first used in Arnhem Land by Ruth Singer in her work at Wadawee. And so the idea is that the speaker is asked to complete a language drawing, which represents in some way their linguistic repertoire in the visual medium, usually by colouring in and annotating a black outline of a body. And the idea is that talking through the drawing elicits the person's linguistic biography, that person's personal linguistic history. In Maningrida, this activity has given us some really interesting insights into the metaphors and ideologies that shape how language is used and thought about and reified. And so the interesting thing was actually most people didn't want to use the outline of the body that is the traditional part of the task. So it was brainstormed what would be the most appropriate way to represent repertoires, and everyone came up with a different strategy. Here's a few examples. So Abby, who we saw before, she's prioritised her main languages at the bottom of a tree trunk and then put them up in sort of descending order of importance. But she's done a second portrait also, a branch of red eucalyptus blossom. These appear in the dry season and they're known in Barada as Martai flowers. You might remember that word from the label of her dialect of Barada. And so these flowers are an important emblem for the clan groups who are subsumed within that dialect label. And so this picture, I think, highlights the connections between clan and language and country. Stanley drew the picture on the left. It's a little bit hard to make out, but basically this is an illustration of a Dreamtime story associated with the Jinang people. And you can see some speech bubbles there. So each of the different ancestral heroes here are speaking a different language as they travel across the land, here highlighting the connections between language and territory, tracing back to those creation narratives and travels of ancestor spirits. The portrait from Guningu man, Alistair, on the right here, he did use a body outline for his portrait, and he's annotated different parts of the body with different languages, but connected each to members of his family. So his father's language and his mother's language and so on. What's interesting as well is that for many of these, he's aligned the kin category with the sign in local sign language. So for example, he's annotated his shoulder, I believe, with his father's language and his forehead with his mother's language, which is the sign in local alternate sign for that particular kin category. And so this highlights another connection. You connect your languages through different kin relations, and that you have different rights and responsibilities to each of those, as well as to the land that with which they're associated. And so lastly, another Barada woman, Laurie, drew an image of her face with a lot of speech bubbles annotated with different languages. And you can see, according to the key on the right, that she's distinguished using colour languages that she speaks versus those that she only hears or speaks a little bit. So that sort of shows how that ideology is playing out both in terms of how people visualize their repertoire, but also in their practices. Okay. So these portraits highlight a whole host of ways of thinking about language and key local ideologies underpinning linguistic diversity. But another important thing that they're highlighting is those language ideologies. So these are some of the language ideologies in play in contemporary Maningrida. Some of these we've seen before. So connections between language and land, deference paid to the language of the place where you are, connection through kin, distinction between speaking and hearing, some interesting stuff about whether you should mix languages, which I may not get to talk about today, and this patrilineal connection. So in some cases, we can see really direct connections between these ideological formations and language practices. So for example, this patrilineal ideology that you should speak your father's language can be seen in evidence in practice and in the socialization routines of young children. So linguist Rebecca Green observed very young babies of Gurgoni fathers whose mothers and primary caregivers spoke a different language being held and told, "Ngadpu Gurgoni Yiweki, yeah, you speak Gurgoni, don't you?" When the question was posed to older children, they were also prompted with the response, "Yitangao," say yes. So kids being constantly reminded and told about their appropriate language that they should be learning, even if they don't have access to it or they're predominantly learning their mother's language. But the adherence to the patrilect is credited by Green, in this case with a major role in the remarkably stable maintenance of Gurgoni across generations with no more than a few dozen speakers. Okay. So the third part of the foundations of linguistic diversity in Maningrida are, of course, the actual language practices. So let's have a look at some of those. Let's take a trip to a couple of places around town and have a listen to what people are saying. So our first stop is the football oval, where the season's grand final is taking place between the Hawks and Baru. That's the Yolngu word for crocodile. So the football's big business in Maningrida, taken very seriously. Lots of fun though, with huge buy-in from across the community, and it's a major focus for social integration in the region. And so crowds are gathered around the oval, and a small group of senior men from 3 different language groups are commentating on the play and on the back of a flatbed truck, and they're mic'd up so everybody can hear them. So let's just have a little listen. You'll see the words written here, and you'll see the color labels telling you about which languages the lexemes are drawn from. So here's some language from the commentator, one of the commentators. So we can see Njebena and English material being drawn on here. Also Njebena and English in this cheer from the crowd. Another cheer from the crowd, or rather a jeer perhaps, drawing on Barada and Njebena and English. Some Jinang from the commentators. He's talking about his bush name, Gaimarana. Some Creole turning up in the crowd. And also another comment from the commentators in English, but with some insertional code switching, dropping a noun in Yungumata and also Barada, meaning food. Ngata, Balaji, both mean food, talking to the crowd.
Don't forget there's still a bit too many Ngata, Balaji. We'll be on sale. A lot of visitors, if you're listening from the other communities.
Okay, and a couple more examples. So here, an example that's this type of code switching shows up very commonly in these settings. So quite tight code switching of the insertional and alternational type between Barada and English.
Like a V shape, like that. And all the girls, go inside. Gura. One line, can't be one line. And when I got the Hawks, one line, and all the girls, one line.
So this is a very different type of code switching to what we see between traditional languages, for example. And then, of course, some English as well, because it is the footy. So I'd love to spend a bit more time talking to you about each of those examples, but just to give you a bit of a flavour, clearly this is a very multilingual setting. So we heard 8 languages from the crowd that day and 6 languages from the commentators alone. And there's a host of reasons that drive code choice in this sort of cut and thrust moment to moment interaction. And we can never really fully capture all of these in an analysis, because sometimes even the speakers themselves aren't sure why a particular language gets used in a particular moment. But here are some motivations that came to the fore from discussions with the commentators. So Yulmumat and Jinang are the father's language for 3 of those commentators, so the appropriate language for there to use. And it's also an appropriate language for the supporters of the Baru team and visitors from further east in Arnhem Land. Barada is the matrilect, so the mother's language for 3 of the commentators, and an appropriate language also for the Baru team. But Barada is also a major language in the local space, with a large L1 and L2 speaker base, and that Barada English mixing, as we saw, frequently drawn upon in these settings, these sort of hybrid spaces. Njebena is the main language for one of the commentators. It's an appropriate language for the other team, the Hawks team. And it's also, as I've mentioned, the appropriate language for the land where Maningrida is. Creole is comparatively marginal, but it is drawn on in community repertoires, and it's appropriate for some of the visitors, while English has broad cross-community comprehensibility, so good for communicating across and including speakers from diverse groups. And it's also kind of an artifact of the footy domain that a lot of language is in English, without any local language equivalents. But in some ways it sort of misses the point to demand motivations behind each of these code switches. So languaging in Maningrida is by default multilingual, and although code boundaries are indeed important and salient, there's a sense in which it's multilingualism, which kind of functions as a lingua franca of sorts. So to borrow a term from Maconey and Pennycook, a multilingua franca, as has been described for other parts of the world. A brief mention of code switching. I won't go through this example, but we saw some different types exemplified above. So insertional switching within traditional languages, traditional language nouns inserted into an English matrix, more alternational code switching between Barada and English. And these types of switches are very common. But what's less common is that kind of code switching within the clause between traditional languages. That's much rarer, and there's a whole host of reasons why that might be, partly to do with an ideology that you can't mix between traditional languages. Where it does happen, such as in this example here, it's quite tends to index quite a special multilingual identity, at least in this region. I can come back to that if anyone's interested. Okay, so another pit stop before we move on. So let's see what's happening at the Maningrida shop. So this is the local store. It's a central hub for the community. Everyone comes through here several times a week, and it's a pretty multilingual space. And so the schema that I'm going to show you is based on a series of real interactions recorded by linguist Vanessa Elwell, but also corroborated by more recent encounters I witnessed at the store. And so what we're seeing here are representations of interactions between the shopkeeper, Tommy, and 4 different customers passing through the checkout and saying a few words. So Tommy is a Gunabidji man, so a traditional owner of Maningrida, and his main language is Njebena. So he's in the minority in Maningrida in that sense. And he's quite multilingual, even for Maningrida, as you can see here. So he's behind the counter serving customers, and let's have a look at what results when he chats to a few customers who come through. So first he chats with 25-year-old Betty. She's a Yolngu woman whose main language is Gupa Poingu, but she also speaks several other Indigenous languages and also English. Because their repertoires only overlap on English and Barada, they speak Barada to each other, which is a second or maybe a 6th language for both of them, and English is usually dispreferred in these interactions. In his second interaction, Tommy chats to 25-year-old Nakara man, Charlie. So Nakara is Charlie's first language, but he also speaks in Njebena. And their conversation includes code switching between those 2 languages. Next, Tommy chats with 30-year-old Susan, whose first language is Barada, and also in Njebena, Tommy's first language. And Susan's married to Tommy's brother, and so in the shop they speak Njebena. And finally, we can compare this interaction to his chat with Ningal, 28-year-old man who also speaks Barada and Njebena like Susan. But in this case, they each use their own first language. They use receptive multilingualism. So you can see that the outcome in terms of linguistic practices is not necessarily predictable from the repertoires that are fed into the dyad. So a brief note here before we finish up about the use of receptive multilingualism again. So this can be seen as a 3rd mode of communication alongside the monolingual mode and code switching. And just a plug for some of Ruth Singer's work on this topic, looking at the multilingual mode at What Are We, where receptive multilingualism is used even in married couples who maintain their own distinct language in interactions at home. And receptive multilingualism is an important part of the picture as to why small languages are able to be maintained over time. That's sort of something that we're not pushing towards accommodation, so those languages can comfortably continue to be spoken. Okay, so just to begin to tie things up, I'd like to zoom out again, this time to consider recent discourses in sociolinguistics and applied linguistics, which have something to say about contemporary multilingual practices around the globe. So there's been an explosion of discussion in the past decade around the complex and novel language practices existing within superdiversity created by globalization. So a key feature of these discussions has been the observation that linguistic repertoires can't be neatly partitioned according to socially or politically constructed boundaries. Not to minimize the impact of this new turn, these discourses have fruitfully served to reframe practices that might formerly have been labelled aberrant or unusual, when in fact they're anything but. But these discourses tend to focus on the city and the West and the current day. And I'm far from the first to note that humanity's multilingual history is likely to have been predominantly non-polyglossic, not taking place within standard language cultures and characterized by practices that we might now consider to be translingual or something like that. And so this is true of the pre-modern West, before linguistic homogeneity was recruited as a tool of the nation state, but also true of various contemporary peripheries, communities that have largely been ignored within these dominant discourses, particularly these contexts of small-scale multilingualism that I've mentioned. So to quote the late great Michael Silverstein, such phenomena that have emerged in the investigation of peripheral local language communities have now gone mainstream at the metropole. Okay, and by way of conclusion, I want to just return to the theme of the conference, the title of the talk, and consider the value of languages and the value of the diverse multilingual ecologies I've spoken about today. In Australia, we have a bit of a problematic double standard when it comes to multilingualism, that we value kids in Melbourne and Sydney learning Indonesian or French, but don't necessarily celebrate or value these rich repertoires of children who are further afield and perhaps more peripheral to our attention. There's lots I could say here, but just in the interest of finishing up on time, I just want to say that really, if we embraced multilingualism rather than adopting an either-or attitude to language repertoires, then we'll find that Indigenous multilingualism could indeed prove a really powerful asset to assist in the maintenance of Indigenous languages, because it's not just isolated languages that require support, it's the whole systems, the language ecologies that sustain them as well. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Jill. Wonderful talk. I know that fairly shortly, some of you may wish to peel off for in preparation for the next sessions. I think the best thing we will do is have a question or two, but I think we have a meet the speaker session, and we can just sort of, if you're interested, just hang around and we can keep the discussion going at least till 1:15. So I will open the floor briefly to anyone who would like to comment or ask some questions. Okay. Well, oh, Phil.
Yeah, I'll ask a question if people are thinking. I just wonder, the comparison you've made, which I think in some of your writing is a bit a kind of rhetorical device to set this up. The comparison you made with the sort of super diversity paradigm. I think what I'm seeing is something very different, because in spite of the sort of stuff that Alistair Pennycock's dug up, where people are using multiple languages, I think the norm for urban super diversity is really a lot of languages sharing a space, but not really interacting with each other very much. And I think what's really kind of, well, it's evidently not unique because you're finding it elsewhere in the world. But what's really unusual in what you're saying is this kind of, I guess you're calling it an ecology, right? But this kind of interweaving of the different languages within a fairly settled community, right? It's not a terribly mobile. This is not about mobility so much, is it?
I guess that's arguable in that mobility was indeed quite common pre-colonially and has expanded post-colonially. I guess we're not talking about mobility of the scale, of course, that is typical of superdiversity. That's not what is bringing new languages into these domains. But I think, to go to your earlier point, I think that's probably true, that there are some differences in terms of the ecological interactions of languages. The point I wanted to make was that some of these practices which are being celebrated and sort of exoticized within a lot of the descriptions of superdiversity, while not identical to small-scale multilingual contexts, do indeed have very similar reflexes that have been around for a long time within these more stable multilingual contexts. So it's not that I'm saying that they're identical, but just that they're not, a lot of these practices are not in fact new. They exist perhaps within different kinds of ecologies and have for a long time. I guess that's
well, I'm wondering, so what, not that they're not new, I'm wondering whether they really exist within the superdiversity paradigm in the way that you're observing them with Maningrida.
Oh, absolutely. No, there are certainly differences. It's the particular types of code switching, the particular kinds of multilingual practices, and the particular kinds of depth and nuances of repertoires, and the flexibility of boundaries where those boundaries come into salience and can fade out of salience depending on the social goals of the particular situation. I guess those are where I see the similarities particularly. But I do take your point, yeah.
Okay, oh, yes, Peter.
Thank you, Jill. That was an absolutely wonderful presentation. I realized why, I think it makes us all realize why we like to be linguists. That's to hear you speak. It's really fascinating. It strikes me that multilingualism, individual multilingualism, is really the norm in the kind of communities that you've been looking at, and I was wondering if that's kind of a kind of an attitude, a societal attitude that maybe we should pay more attention to, because I guess in other parts of Australia, other segments of Australian society, sometimes it's not necessarily expected people have more than one language in their repertoire. Whereas I'm guessing that it's very much the norm in Maningrida. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what's interesting about gaining more knowledge of these particular contexts is understanding the broader sociocultural system that supports that kind of ability to be highly multilingual. I think we are socialized into the idea that multilingualism presents boundaries and barriers to communication. It's going to be problematic, and how is it going to work? And of course there are logistical challenges, but actually what we see in a community like Maningrida is that actually we can all be multilingual and work out strategies within interactions, change our ideologies, change our way of thinking about it, and come up with some way of supporting that diversity and allow that to kind of carry interaction along, rather than assuming that it's monolingualism that's the only way to go. And I mean, in fact, we're quite comfortable with being perhaps multilectal. We don't see that as a barrier to communication for perhaps obvious reasons, but some of these practices already have reflexes within our repertoires. We are multilectal. Multilingualism isn't so different, really.
Katrina, would you like to ask a question?
Thank you, Jill. With the footy match, were the 4 on different radio channels, or just there on the back of the truck, or how did that work?
It's a very good question. It's a very dynamic setting. I think from memory there were 2 microphones, so sometimes allowing dual commentary to be broadcast, but very much there's kind of a switch between the commentators depending on what needed to happen in terms of crowd control or what was happening with the play. So yeah, I think 2 microphones and different people kind of coming up and down.
Thank you.
Antonia.
Yes, thank you so much, Jill, for this wonderful presentation. I just have a couple of questions. First, you could say something about language mixing and also this notion that code switching, you know, can be allowed between certain languages, but not between others. And also, I was just wondering whether these multilingual speakers have any, whether they have any notion of language dominance, whether they would consider, you know, one language much more dominant perhaps in their language repertoire than the others, perhaps because, you know, it actually serves many more functions, or also maybe in writing, something like that. Thank you.
Thank you for your question. Your first question is always my favorite question to be asked. I could talk about that for hours. So yeah, the idea of code switching and the sort of intrusion of ideology in code switching practices is very interesting to me. So the practices that I've observed in Maningrida align with what's been described for some other contexts of small-scale multilingualism. For example, Patience Epps's work in the Valpes region of the Rio Negro region in South America. So code switching between traditional languages is very, very rarely seen. So you'll see it perhaps at the level of outside of the clause quite commonly, where someone will have a stretch in one traditional language and then switch to another traditional language. But you won't very commonly see, for example, insertional or alternational switching between the two of them. And it's an interesting point because if you take some assumptions from the code switching literature, if there are parallel grammatical structures in two related languages, then the code switching ought to be quite easy. You know what I mean? There's sort of that assumption that it's licensed because you've got an easy switch point, for example. In fact, what we see is that the close sort of alternational code switching tends to be between traditional languages and English or contact varieties, which are of course very different in terms of their grammatical structures. But that switching is somehow socially licensed in a way that switching between traditional languages in the Australian context, I guess because of that patrilineal inheritance, the connection with language and land, there's a sense that it's not a good thing to be mixing unless you have a right to the other language. There's a children's reader in the local school, which is entitled "A Drunk Got His Languages Mixed." And it talks about a man called Stanley who is observed engaging in aberrant behavior, and he was mixing Gunbalang and Njebena, and what a crazy thing to do, even though of course everyone understands that he would have competence in both, that's not in question, but the mixing is seen as some kind of transgressive behavior. So I think that gives us an insight into the ideologies. I could say lots more about that, but we'll see if we have time. And the second question, I think the dominance is an interesting one because the ideology gets in the way. The ideology is that you have best competence in your father's language. We very much know that that's not the case. It's something that, again, a plug for Ruth Singer's work. She's looking into what actually receptive competence looks like. So she's running some experiments at Waterwee to look at how much people are actually able to speak and understand a language when they say, and when they sort of repeat that ideology. So not something I'm afraid I can give a very clear answer to, but it's very much a live research topic at the moment. Thanks.
Josh has asked a question in the chat.
Yeah, sorry, I can't raise my hand, I think, because I'm co-host. Thank you so much for the fantastic talk, Jill. I was just wondering if you know how the multilingualism is navigated at school. You showed some pictures, with children learning languages in school, and I was just wondering how is that? Yeah,
it's a really interesting question. So until 2008, due to various changes in legislation in the Northern Territory, the school was running a trilingual program. So Njebena, the local language, the appropriate local language, was one stream. Barada, the largest speaker group, was another stream, and then English as well. And kids from other language groups sort of got lumped into either Njebena or Barada, depending on various factors like social relations between those groups. So that, might have held that up as an example of a really successful multilingual curriculum. 2008, things changed. Pretty devastating stories of, bilingual readers and materials being taken to the local dump. in order for the curriculum to change, and teachers having to go and pull them off the dump. So, you know, a very hot political situation around bilingual education in the NT. In more recent years, the Lura language and culture team are doing kind of language and culture classes. So it's not really a full multilingual curriculum, but they're doing some targeted few hours a week cultural knowledge in language, which happens across actually many more languages than was possible with the curriculum. So arguably it's a really nice outcome for some of those smaller languages which are now represented. But I mean, it's an open question. How do you manage 15 local languages in a school curriculum? I don't have the answer. I wish it was easy. But yeah, certainly striving to do it as best they can with what's possible.
Okay, thanks.
Thanks.
I can ask a question if no one. Has anyone else got a question before I jump in? If not, Jill, you mentioned that the local sign language possibly does function as something, perhaps as something of a lingua franca, or at least that's what I understood. To what can you tell us about the, you know, how multilectal is the use of sign, or how multimodal is the use of language? Maybe another way of coming.
Yeah. Absolutely, Joe. I mean, it's such an interesting question, and again, something we know just woefully little about, but also something actively being researched by Jenny Green and other colleagues, Margaret Carew, in the Maningrida context. So the answer, I guess, is that speech is absolutely multimodal, but that some of the pre-colonial and traditional, in inverted commas, functions of sign in the community are diminishing. So the school did a bit of a sort of test a few years back to see how much sign kids knew, for example, the kinship sign, and we're a bit dismayed to see that the kids had lost a lot of, or hadn't gained that knowledge. And so that's now been fed into that language and culture curriculum as an explicit teaching thing. But as you will know, Joe, there's all sorts of applications for the local alternate sign. So in sort of taboo situations, so mediating relationships between two taboo relations, for example, a man and his mother-in-law, sign can be a way to sort of circumnavigate direct communication for respect. Communicating across distance, that absolutely happens. Kinship, I think, is probably one of the domains where it is still quite vital and still known about and still used. But it's not the case that this is a fully fledged communicative system in and of itself. That's why we call it an alternate sign language. It kind of supports spoken communication where direct speech is not possible or appropriate. Yeah.
Thanks, Jill. I think we could probably have one last question from Katrina, and that will probably take us up to past.
As a non-linguist, I'm getting a little bit lost in all the terms, but the difference between multilingualism and multilingualisms, plural.
Yeah. Well, that's really a coinage of our own, mine and Ruth Singer's, I guess, and it's really just to emphasise that monolingualism is not just one thing. So it's that kind of goes back to that point of when we think of multilingualism, very often we're thinking about that sort of hierarchical nation state orderly multilingualism where you have a neat hierarchy, some language is used for some domains, some language is used for others, when in fact there's a great diversity of different types of multilingual models that we see around the world. So when we put that extra little S in, it's from the special issue that we did in 2018, we just wanted to emphasize that there's more than one type.
Got it. Thanks. You. Yeah.
Well, look, I think that was just an absolutely wonderful talk, and I think we should all congratulate Jill for her wonderful work and this fabulous opportunity to have heard about this fantastically interesting part of the world.
Thanks so much, Joe. Thanks for the invite again. It's been a pleasure.
Absolute pleasure to have you come and speak for us. Thanks, Jill.
Thank you so much, Jill, and thank you so much, Joe, as well. And thank you to everyone for all of your great questions too. We've learned so much from you, Jill. I learned so much myself today. It was a brilliant talk. I really, really enjoyed it. Lots of important and thought-provoking ideas.